Hey guys, tonight we are stepping way back in time, shedding the modern world like a too heavy cloak, and immersing ourselves in a place where the concept of a locked door, or even a quiet corner all to yourself, was less a given right and more like, well, a strange, unheard of luxury. Imagine just for a moment that you're lying in your comfy bed right now, maybe scrolling through your phone, or perhaps just letting your mind wander before sleep claims you. You're probably alone, or maybe with a partner, but you have walls around you, a door you can close, and a general expectation that whatever you're doing in this personal space is, personal. Now, take all of that cozy, private insulation and just discard it. Toss it right out the window. Because where we're going tonight, privacy, especially anything remotely connected to horizontal recreation, simply didn't exist in the way you understand it. Prepare yourselves, because understanding medieval life means understanding a world where everyone was pretty much in everyone else's business all the time. It's a bit like living in a permanent, slightly smelly reality show, and honestly, you probably wouldn't survive a week before wishing you could just pull a blanket over your head and disappear. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now, joining this quiet little corner of the internet from wherever you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself waking up, not in a quiet room with soft sheets, but perhaps on a straw-filled mattress, maybe shared with a few family members, and possibly a chicken or two that wandered in overnight. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke from the central hearth that warmed the single room, the lingering scent of dinner, likely pottage or coarse bread, and the less than pleasant aromas of unwashed bodies and nearby livestock. Your home? It's small, probably just one main room, maybe two if you're relatively well off. But even then, these aren't rooms with dedicated purposes like a modern living room or bedroom. This single space, often called a hall house or a cottage, is where everything happens. You eat here, you work here, you socialize here, and yes, you sleep here, and you don't sleep alone. Your family is all around you, not just parents and siblings, but maybe a grandparent, an aunt or uncle, a cousin, and perhaps even a couple of unrelated farmhands or apprentices who live as part of the household. They're sleeping on pallets on the floor, in shared beds, or huddled near the fire. There are no bedrooms with doors you can close. There are no quiet, private corners. The sounds of snoring, shifting bodies, coughing, and the rustling of straw are your constant companions. The light, when it comes, streams through small, unglazed window openings, or simply pours down the smoke hole in the roof. You are always visible, always audible. Trying to have a hushed conversation, let alone engage in anything requiring discretion, would be like trying to whisper in the middle of a bustling market square. Good luck with that. This lack of physical separation within the home is the bedrock of the medieval privacy deficit. Your life, from the moment you wake until you fall asleep, unfolds in a communal theater. You dress, which wasn't an elaborate affair for most. You eat, you tend to chores, all under the direct gaze of everyone else sharing your living space. Imagine trying to have a romantic moment with your spouse when your mother-in-law is sleeping on a mat 3 feet away and your teenage brother is trying to quiet a restless piglet in the corner. It's challenging, to say the least. This isn't just about sex, though that's a big part of it. It's about any personal moment. If you're upset, everyone sees it. If you're happy, everyone sees it. If you're nursing a baby, everyone sees it. There's no retreating to a private room to compose yourself or have a quiet moment of reflection. Your emotional landscape, much like your physical one, is pretty much on public display for your household audience. Now step outside this crowded dwelling, and things don't exactly get more private. Medieval villages and towns were compact, with buildings often huddled together for defense and convenience. Streets were narrow, and people lived in close proximity. The sounds of your life bled into your neighbors' lives, and vice versa. You could often hear conversations, arguments, laughter, and yes, potentially other activities, spilling out of open doorways and windows. There wasn't the buffer zone of lawns or significant distances between homes that we often have today. Your neighbor wasn't just someone down the street. They were someone whose comings and goings you were acutely aware of, and who was acutely aware of yours. This created a sort of ambient social surveillance, a constant, low-level awareness of what everyone around you was up to. It wasn't malicious spying necessarily, although gossip was certainly a popular pastime. It was just the natural consequence of living cheek by jowl in small communities. Think about the logistics of daily life. Many tasks we perform in private today were done communally or semi-publicly. Washing clothes might happen at a communal well or stream where you'd be chatting with other villagers. Fetching water was a social activity. Even something as simple as taking a leak wasn't always a solitary endeavor, as private latrines were rare, and people often used fields, alleys, or designated and often less than private spots. This constant overlap of personal necessity and public space further eroded any expectation of solitude or anonymity. You were always part of the collective, always within sight or earshot of someone. This constant exposure meant that reputations were easily made and lost. Your actions, whether intentional or accidental, were witnessed, discussed, and judged by your neighbors. If you had an argument with your spouse, the village probably heard it. If you were seen flirting with someone you shouldn't be, it would be the talk of the market by noon. There was immense social pressure to conform to community norms, precisely because deviating from them was so visible. It's like living under a microscopic lens, except the lens is the collective gaze of everyone you know. This isn't just a quirky tidbit. It's a fundamental aspect of medieval social structure that shaped behavior in profound ways. The visibility wasn't just physical, it was social and reputational. Historians still debate whether the very concept of privacy, as we understand it, an inherent right to solitude and control over one's personal information and space, even existed in the medieval mind. Was it something they lacked and perhaps yearned for? Or was it a concept so alien that it simply wouldn't have occurred to them? Were they perfectly comfortable with this level of communal existence, having known nothing else? It's a fascinating question because it challenges our modern assumptions about fundamental human needs. We see privacy as essential for intimacy, reflection, and personal autonomy. Did medieval people find intimacy in different ways? Did they reflect collectively? Was personal autonomy a less valued trait than community integration? These are questions that are difficult to answer definitively, as medieval sources tend to describe the how of life rather than the way of their internal feelings about concepts we now take for granted. The point is, the physical and social environment of medieval Europe was intrinsically anti-private. It was built on visibility, shared resources, and constant community interaction. Your home was open, your street was your neighbor's earshot, and your daily activities were performed under a communal gaze. This foundational reality set the stage for how everything else operated, from marriage and childbirth to law and religion. When your entire existence is this transparent, keeping anything, especially something as intimate and potentially fraught with social and moral rules as sexual activity, truly private becomes an almost impossible feat. It wasn't just difficult, it was structurally and culturally discouraged by the very fabric of their daily lives. This wasn't a society designed for alone time. It was a society designed for togetherness, for better or worse. And that togetherness meant your life, including your most personal moments, was lived out in the open. And this isn't just about the walls, or lack thereof, in your home. Imagine that every aspect of your life, especially the bits you'd prefer to keep quiet, is under constant review, not just by your nosy neighbors, but by an omnipresent, all-seeing institution with direct lines to both divine judgment and local enforcement. We're talking, of course, about the church. In medieval Europe, the church wasn't just a place you went on Sunday, if you were lucky enough to get a day off. It was the absolute center of community life, moral authority, and even a significant part of the legal system. Its influence seeped into everything from how you farmed your land to, you guessed it, your most intimate moments. The church had very specific ideas about sex, many ideas, like a lot of ideas. And they weren't shy about telling you exactly what those ideas were and how you were expected to behave. Sex, outside of procreation within the bonds of marriage, was generally viewed with suspicion, if not outright condemnation. Even within marriage, it came with a rulebook longer and more complex than assembling flat-pack furniture after 3 glasses of mead. Forbidden times, Lent, Advent, feast days, Sundays, Fridays, Wednesdays, sometimes even Saturdays. Honestly, it's a wonder anyone reproduced. Forbidden positions, forbidden thoughts. The list went on. And the church didn't just set these rules, it actively worked to ensure you followed them, and crucially, that any transgressions didn't remain secret. The primary tool for prying into your private life was the confessional. While the formal requirement for annual confession to a priest wasn't solidified until the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, a major mainstream historical fact that profoundly impacted people's lives, the practice of confession had been growing in importance for centuries. Think about that for a second. Once a year at minimum, you were required to sit down with a priest and detail every single sin you had committed since your last visit. Every bad thought, every lie, every angry word, and yes, every deviation from the church's strict sexual code. Imagine having to confess to Father Thomas, who you see every day at the market and who probably knows your Uncle Bartholomew better than you do, about that time well, you get the picture. It required a level of candidness about your private life that would make most modern people spontaneously combust. The priest wasn't just a passive recipient of your sins. They were also, by design, embedded within the community. They knew the local families, the relationships, the tensions, and the gossip. When you confessed, you weren't just talking to a spiritual advisor. You were talking to a prominent local figure who was likely aware of the general shape of your life already. If you confessed to adultery, and the entire village already suspected something because, remember, you're living in a perpetual reality show, the priest was in a position to guide you toward public penance and reconciliation. If you didn't confess something the priest suspected, well, that could lead to uncomfortable questions. This created a unique form of moral surveillance, layering over the physical visibility we talked about in the last section. Your neighbors could see you and your priest could hear your secrets. Double whammy. This didn't just apply to obvious sins like adultery. The church had doctrines about masturbation, contraception, in the forms they understood it, often herbal remedies or withdrawal, bestiality, and any sexual act deemed unnatural or non-procreative, often broadly labeled as sodomy. You weren't just committing a sin in the eyes of God, you were potentially committing an offense that could have social and legal consequences. A truly quirky tidbit is the sheer details some confessional manuals went into, listing specific sins, variations, and even suggested penances for acts we'd consider deeply private or even non-issues today. Some manuals had intricate questions about dreams, thoughts, and even positions during intercourse, demonstrating an almost obsessive level of interest in controlling sexual behavior down to the most minute detail. Imagine trying to explain that to your parish priest without blushing furiously. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I think I had a slightly impure thought about my spouse last Tuesday, and I'm not entirely sure I did it in the approved missionary position." It's almost comically intrusive from a modern perspective, but for them, it was deadly serious, tied to the fate of your immortal soul. And if your confession wasn't deemed sufficient, or if your sins were public knowledge and scandalous, the church had courts for that. Yes, church courts, often run by the local bishop or archdeacon, handled a wide range of cases, but a significant portion involved moral transgressions, including sexual ones. These weren't like the secular courts dealing with theft or violence. These were courts focused on upholding Christian morality and canon law. You could be brought before the court for fornication, sex outside marriage, adultery, concubinage, sometimes even if your marriage was seen as irregular or if you weren't fulfilling your marital duties according to church doctrine. The evidence might come from your neighbor's testimony, remember that constant surveillance, or even from your own confession if the priest deemed it a public scandal. requiring more than private penance. Appearing before a church court was not a private affair. The proceedings might be held publicly, and the punishments often involve public shaming. You might be ordered to stand outside the church door during Mass, wearing a white sheet or some other marker of shame, so everyone entering and leaving could see you. You might have to walk through the village in procession, carrying a candle as a sign of penance. Sometimes you'd be ordered to make a public apology or swear an oath to God and the community that you wouldn't repeat the offense. This public nature of punishment served as a deterrent, of course, but it also ensured that your private failing became a very public spectacle. There was no hiding your shame. It was broadcast for the entire community to witness, cementing the fact that your sexual behavior was not just your own business, but a matter of public moral concern enforced by the highest spiritual authority. This brings us to a point that historians still debate. Just how effective was all this church oversight in truly regulating people's private sexual lives? While the rules were clear and the mechanisms for enforcement existed, did people actually adhere to them strictly? Did they confess everything? Did they manage to find ways to have sex on forbidden days or in forbidden ways without getting caught or feeling crippling guilt? Sources like court records show that people were indeed prosecuted for sexual offenses, suggesting the system did catch people. But court records only show those who were caught and prosecuted, not the vast majority who perhaps didn't get caught, or whose minor sins were handled via private confession and penance without escalating. It's hard to know the true gap between the ideal behavior prescribed by the church and the messy reality of human relationships and desires in medieval villages and towns. Was the omnipresent eye of the church a genuine deterrent, or did people just get very good at being discreet, or perhaps just accepted occasional penance as part of life? The church's framework of morality, confession, and public penance created an environment where privacy, particularly around sexual matters, was not just difficult to achieve physically, but also actively discouraged and undermined institutionally. Your soul's health was the church's business, and since sexual behavior was intricately linked to sin and salvation, your sex life effectively became the church's business too. This wasn't just abstract theology, it translated into tangible intrusions into daily life, forcing people to reveal their most private acts and thoughts to external authorities and potentially face public consequences. It was a system built on transparency, accountability in community, and a profound interconnectedness where the spiritual health of individuals was seen as tied to the moral health of the collective. So when you combine the physical reality of living in close quarters with the social reality of a deeply interconnected community, and layer on top the powerful moral and quasi-legal authority of the church, which actively sought to regulate and monitor private behavior through confession and courts, you get a picture where the very idea of keeping your sex life under wraps becomes almost absurd. It wasn't just that you couldn't find a private space, it was that even if you did, you were expected to reveal what you did there anyway, under pain of eternal damnation and temporal shame. It was a world where your bedroom activities, or lack thereof, or the specifics of them, were potentially matters for the village priest, the bishop's court, and the gossip mill. Makes complaining about targeted ads on your phone feel significantly less intrusive, doesn't it? Imagine confessing your search history. Good heavens, this constant oversight shaped behavior, enforced norms, and created a collective understanding that personal conduct, especially sexual conduct, was a public and religious concern, not a private one. It's another layer as fundamental as the lack of walls. That explains why privacy, in the modern sense, was a foreign concept in medieval times, particularly when it came to anything remotely connected to sex or marriage. The eyes weren't just on you physically, they were expected to be on your soul too. And the priest was the soul's designated auditor. And if the walls didn't exist, and the church was keeping tabs on your soul, then the community itself was essentially a perpetual neighborhood watch program, but like mandatory, and with much higher stakes than whether you mowed your lawn. Think about where you lived in medieval times, especially if you were one of the vast majority living outside of larger towns or cities. You were in a village, and these weren't sprawling suburbs. They were small, contained, tightly knit communities where everyone knew everyone, and probably their grandparents too. Your life wasn't just lived near others, it was lived with others in constant, unavoidable proximity. Imagine your village. It's probably centered around the church, which we just talked about. Perhaps the Lord's manor house, and maybe a mill or a forge. Homes are clustered together, probably sharing walls or certainly standing very close. Your daily rhythm is dictated by shared activities. Working the communal fields, fetching water from the same well, attending church services together, market days, festivals, and just, existing within spitting distance of your neighbors. There's no popping into your car and driving miles away for groceries. Your world is the few hundred yards around your home. This enforced closeness meant that keeping anything truly secret was incredibly difficult. Your neighbors weren't just people you waved to, they were people you saw, interacted with, and relied upon every single day. And they saw you. This constant physical and social interaction created a powerful organic network of surveillance and information sharing. Every cough, every argument, every new piece of clothing, every visitor, every late-night visitor, every pregnancy, it was all observed and discussed. Think of it as a pre-internet, pre-telephone, pre-television social network, where the main form of communication was face-to-face interaction and the spread of gossip was astonishingly rapid and effective. Your reputation wasn't built on an online profile. It was built on the collective opinion of the people around you, forged through countless daily observations and whispered conversations. And this reputation was absolutely crucial, shaping your social standing, your marriage prospects, and even your ability to conduct basic economic transactions within the village. So when it came to something like your sex life, this intense community scrutiny was inescapable. Forget about clandestine affairs or quiet deviations from social norms. If you were seen talking to someone of the opposite sex a little too often behind the barn, or if a particular unmarried woman's belly started to swell, the entire village knew about it, discussed it, and formed opinions about it seemingly instantly. There were no hidden lives. Your private behavior was, by necessity and design, part of the public record, maintained in the collective memory and ongoing chatter of the community. This wasn't malicious in the way we might think of modern gossip. It was a fundamental part of how these small societies functioned, maintaining social order and reinforcing norms through peer pressure and collective judgment. A mainstream historical fact here is the importance of reputation in medieval society, particularly for women. A woman's honor and virginity before marriage and fidelity within marriage were not just personal matters. They were tied to the honor of her family and were constantly under community evaluation. Loose behavior, real or perceived, could significantly harm her prospects, her family's standing, and her ability to make a good marriage. For men, while perhaps not as rigidly scrutinized regarding premarital activity, hello, double standards, even in the Dark Ages, infidelity within marriage was also a community concern, disrupting the social fabric and potentially involving church courts, as we just discussed. The collective gaze wasn't just curious, it was a mechanism of social control. Consider the physical layout again. Homes often had single rooms, or perhaps one main room, where the entire family lived, ate, and slept. This meant children and often servants or other relatives were witness to their parents' or hosts' most private interactions. There wasn't a separate bedroom to retreat to, a soundproofed space to maintain personal boundaries. Even within the family unit, privacy as we understand it was a luxury almost nobody could afford. This internal lack of physical privacy spilled outwards, as family life was lived in plain sight of the neighbors, through open doors in warm weather, through thin walls year-round, and during shared tasks just outside the home. This communal living also meant that social events were inherently public. Weddings, births, funerals, festivals. These were moments when the entire community came together, observing and participating in key life cycle events that often had a sexual or marital component. Even betrothal rituals involved public declarations and community witnessing. There was no eloping, no quiet courthouse marriage. Getting married was a public contract between two families, sanctioned by the church and witnessed by the village. The start of your legitimate sex life was announced to everyone, and its continuation was implicitly under review. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this is the practice of rough music, or charivari. This was a form of public shaming enacted by the community upon individuals who had violated social norms, particularly those related to marriage, sexuality, or gender roles. If, for example, an old man married a much younger woman, or if there were rumors of infidelity or domestic disputes that upset the village's sense of order, groups of villagers might gather outside the offending party's home at night, banging pots and pans, shouting insults, and making general cacophony. This wasn't official legal punishment. It was community justice, a powerful, noisy, and very public declaration that your private life had become unacceptable to the collective. It was a direct response to actions that, while happening within the home, were deemed to have disturbed the community's peace and moral order. It highlights how deeply intertwined individual behavior and community standards were. Your personal decisions had public repercussions, enforced by the very people you lived alongside. This constant social pressure and visibility also meant that disputes and tensions within households or between individuals were often played out, or at least discussed, publicly. Marital problems, disagreements about dowry, arguments over inheritance, these weren't always kept behind closed doors. They could spill out into the street, become subjects of gossip, and even escalate to require intervention from neighbors, the village elders, the Lord, or the church. There was a limited expectation that your domestic life was purely your own business. If it caused unrest or violated norms, the community felt it had a right, even a duty, to involve itself. Historians still argue whether this intense community pressure was primarily a force for good, maintaining stability and enforcing Christian morality, or if it was often oppressive, stifling individuality and creating an environment of fear and conformity. Did it truly prevent sin and disorder, or did it just force people to be more secretive and hypocritical? It's hard to say definitively. Sources like court records show the failures of this system, the people who were caught and punished, but they don't show the countless instances where the fear of being caught or the desire to maintain a good reputation successfully deterred people from breaking norms. Was it a system that promoted genuine virtue, or just external compliance driven by the fear of public shame? The answer likely lies somewhere in the messy middle, varying from person to person and village to village. The takeaway is that in this world, your actions, even those that might seem deeply personal to us, were constantly being monitored and judged by your peers. There was no concept of, it's nobody's business but mine, when it came to behavior that impacted the community's moral landscape. And sexual behavior was absolutely seen as impacting that landscape, tied up with marriage, family honor, legitimacy of children, and religious salvation. You were not just living in a physical space, you were living inside a social panopticon where the collective eye was always watching and the collective voice was always ready to comment. Combine this with the physical layout of homes and villages, the ever-present authority of the church listening in the confessional, and the lack of dedicated private spaces, and the picture becomes clear. Privacy around sex was not a practical option because of the physical environment, not a social norm because of the community structure, and not a moral right because of religious doctrine. You were visible, accountable to God and your neighbors, and expected to conform. And if you didn't, well, you might find out what rotten tomatoes smelled like up close, or hear a symphony of pots and pans outside your window at 2 a.m. Not exactly conducive to a relaxed private evening, is it? It makes you appreciate modern soundproofing and the blessed anonymity of ordering takeout in your pajamas. So you've got the church keeping a close eye on your soul, reminding you constantly that sin is a big deal, and you've got your neighbors watching your every move, ready to shame you or just, talk about you behind your back, or maybe right in front of you, medieval style. But what happens when this community surveillance or religious concern escalates beyond gossip and stern looks? That's where the formal structures of medieval society kicked in, specifically the legal systems. And trust me, these systems were very interested in your private life, particularly anything related to marriage, sex, and family. Medieval Europe wasn't a single unified legal entity, of course. Laws and customs varied wildly depending on where you were, England, France, Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, and even within regions, you had different layers of authority. But broadly speaking, you were subject to at least two major types of legal jurisdiction: the secular courts and the church courts. And when it came to sex, marriage, and immorality, the church courts were often the big players, holding immense power over aspects of your life we'd now consider intensely personal and outside the state's or any institution's direct purview. Think of the church courts as a parallel legal system running alongside the king's courts or the Lord's manorial courts. They had their own judges, usually bishops or archdeacons or their officials, their own lawyers. Yes, medieval canon lawyers were a thing, their own procedures, and their own prisons or penances. Their authority stemmed from canon law, the body of laws developed by the church. And canon law had a lot to say about how you were supposed to behave, especially sexually. Marriage was a sacrament, a holy bond, so its formation, dissolution, via annulment, improper conduct fell squarely under church jurisdiction. Sexual sins like fornication, sex outside marriage, adultery, sex with someone other than your spouse, bigamy, marrying while already married, incest, defined quite broadly sometimes, and, God forbid, sodomy, often a catch-all for non-procreative or unnatural acts, were all matters for the church courts. Let's say your neighbors, those eagle eyes we talked about, reported you for living in sin with someone you weren't married to. Or perhaps your local priest, having heard rumors or even getting a confession that didn't quite cut it for absolution, decided action was needed. You could find yourself summoned to the archdeacon's court. Appearing before this court wasn't a quiet private chat. It was a formal legal proceeding. Charges would be read, witnesses might be called, and remember, these witnesses were often your neighbors or people you knew, and you'd have to respond. The court would investigate. They'd ask questions about your relationship, your living situation, perhaps even your sexual activity. All of this, once whispered about in the village, now became part of a formal, recorded inquiry. Your private life was being dissected in a legal forum. The punishments handed down by church courts weren't usually execution or lengthy prison sentences, though they could excommunicate you, which was arguably worse than prison for your medieval soul and social standing. More common were penances, which were often designed to be public and humiliating. You might be ordered to stand at the church door during Mass, holding a candle, confessing your sin to everyone entering. Or you might have to walk around the market wearing a sign detailing your offense. Imagine, here walks your name, convicted of gasp fornication. Pray for my soul. Talk about a public service announcement you didn't ask for. Fines were also common, providing a nice bit of income for the church courts, which cynically leads some historians to wonder if moral crusades were sometimes also financial ventures. It's like being fined for double parking your conscience, except the fine is collected by the archdeacon and everyone gets to watch you pay up in shame. While church courts handled the moral and marital stuff, secular courts could also get involved, albeit usually from a different angle. If your sexual behavior led to a breach of the peace, like a brawl erupting over a lover's quarrel, the Lord's court might step in. Rape was considered a serious crime by secular law, though prosecuting it and achieving conviction could be incredibly difficult, relying heavily on witness testimony and the victim's reputation. Matters of inheritance and property disputes often hinged on the legitimacy of children, which in turn depended on the parents' marital status, pulling secular courts into questions of marriage and sexual conduct that the church courts also claimed jurisdiction over. This overlap could create complicated legal messes, with individuals sometimes being prosecuted in both systems for different aspects of the same event. Trying to figure out which court had dibs on your particular brand of sin was probably a headache, assuming you weren't too busy worrying about the actual punishment. A mainstream historical fact here is that the church's jurisdiction over marriage and sexual morality was one of its most powerful tools for influencing the daily lives of ordinary people across all social classes in medieval Europe. From peasants to nobles, everyone was theoretically subject to canon law and liable to be called before an ecclesiastical court. This wasn't just theory. Court records show these courts were active and dealt with a huge volume of cases related to sex and marriage. demonstrating their real impact. Gathering evidence for these cases often relied heavily on community knowledge and reputation. Witnesses would testify to what they had seen, heard, or what was common knowledge in the village. If the fama, the public reputation or rumor, in the community suggested someone was living immorally, that in itself could be considered evidence by the courts, particularly the church courts. This loops us right back to Section 3. The gossip and surveillance of your neighbors weren't just social annoyances, they could form the basis for formal legal proceedings against you. Your perceived lack of privacy in the community fed directly into the potential for formal, legal intrusions into your life. A quirky or fringe tidbit that illustrates the reach of these courts is the concept of spousal debt, debitum conjugale in canon law. This was the idea that within a marriage, each spouse had a debt to the other, the right to sexual relations upon request. Refusing this without a just cause, like illness or religious vows made by mutual consent, could in some cases be grounds for complaint to the church courts. Imagine telling a judge, "Your Honor, my husband-wife won't fulfill their spousal debt," and the court taking it seriously. While actual prosecutions for this might have been rare compared to fornication or adultery, the very existence of this concept in law shows how deeply the church courts delved into the intimate dynamics of marriage, regulating even the sexual obligations between husband and wife. It wasn't just about preventing bad sex. It was about ensuring good or proper sex happened according to their rules. Historians still argue whether the primary goal of these church courts was genuine moral reform and the salvation of souls, or maintaining social order, reinforcing the church's authority, and generating revenue through fines. Were they effective in shaping behavior, or did people just get better at hiding their activities? The records show many cases being brought, but they don't tell us how many people successfully concealed their relationships or sins. And while the potential for public shaming and excommunication was real, it's likely that enforcement varied greatly depending on the region, the energy of the local officials, and the social status of the accused. It's hard to definitively say if the system was a well-oiled machine for enforcing privacy violations or a creaky, inconsistent apparatus that caught only the unlucky or the unpopular. So whether it was your priest hearing your deepest secrets in confession, your neighbors reporting your activities or lack thereof to the local authorities, or the formal legal systems of church and state summoning you to answer for your conduct, there were multiple layers of external scrutiny applied to your sexual and marital life. You couldn't just disappear behind closed doors and expect to be left alone. Your actions were subject to observation, gossip, denunciation, and potentially formal legal inquiry and punishment. Any notion of sex being purely a private matter between consenting adults was simply not how medieval society or its legal and religious structures operated. Your intimacies had public consequences, enforced by everyone from the village busybody to the solemn archdeacon. It makes getting a parking ticket feel positively liberating, doesn't it? So they weren't just judging you, not just making you stand outside church with a candle. They were writing it all down. This was perhaps one of the most fundamental ways your supposed private life was made public and permanent, through the creation of official records. Forget about just getting caught in the act or having your neighbors whisper. Now your indiscretions, your marital status, the very legitimacy of your children could be inscribed onto parchment or paper, stored away in chests and archives, leaving a paper trail long after you were gone. Across medieval Europe, a surprisingly vast amount of documentation was generated, and a significant portion of it touched directly upon people's personal relationships, their family lives, and yes, their sexual conduct. We're talking about court rolls from secular, manorial, or royal courts, act books and registers from those powerful church courts we mentioned in Section 4, records from town councils, and later parish registers. Each type of record captured different facets of life, but together they formed a mosaic of information that could expose aspects of your life you might desperately have wanted to keep quiet. Take the church court records, for instance. These are gold mines for historians studying medieval social and sexual history because they were so focused on morality and family life. You find thousands upon thousands of cases dealing with fornication, adultery, slander, often related to sexual reputation, disputes over marriage contracts, attempts to prove or disprove the validity of a marriage, and even those bizarre cases about the refusal of spousal debt. The scribe meticulously noted down the names of the accused and accusers, the nature of the alleged offense, summaries of witness testimonies, often spilling juicy, if biased, details, the court's judgment, and the penance or fine imposed. Imagine the medieval equivalent of having your worst dating fails or marital spats transcribed for posterity by a monk with a quill pen. Sleep tight. These records weren't just kept for idle curiosity. They were essential for the functioning of the legal system. The church courts needed them to track cases, ensure penances were performed, and manage their finances. Those fines added up. Secular courts relied on documentation to handle inheritance disputes, which often required proving legitimate lineage, meaning they needed to know if parents were legally married and who the father truly was. Manorial lords kept rolls of their tenants, noting marriages, births, and deaths, partly to track who owed them rent or services, but also to settle local disputes, many of which stemmed from relationship issues or sexual misconduct within the village community. It was all interconnected. Your landlord might end up being the one noting down that you were fined by the church court for getting a bit too friendly with someone you weren't married to. A mainstream historical fact that emerges clearly from studying these records is the systematic way medieval authorities, particularly the church, monitored and attempted to regulate sexual behavior across all levels of society. These records demonstrate that moral policing wasn't just theoretical. It was an active process that generated paper trails, drawing individuals from all walks of life into the legal system for matters we'd consider intensely private. They show the reach of the church's authority into the most intimate corners of people's lives. Consider a case of alleged adultery found in a 14th century English bishop's register. The record might name the accused man and woman, state where and when the affair was thought to have occurred, perhaps even in the barn behind Thomas's house on the feast of Saint Michael. List the neighbors who testified that they saw the couple together late at night, or that fama, common rumor, held them to be lovers, and finally detail the public penance required, like being whipped around the marketplace. This wasn't just a judgment, it was a narrative, however brief and biased, of a deeply personal event, captured and preserved by officialdom. It reads like a medieval police report crossed with a gossip column, filed away for future reference. As time went on, particularly from the later medieval period into the early modern era, parish registers became increasingly common. Kept by the local priest, these recorded baptisms, usually shortly after birth, marriages, and burials. While their primary purpose might seem demographic, they still documented the fundamental structure of family life and reproduction. A baptism record noted the parents effectively confirming their relationship and the child's entry into the community. The absence of a father's name in a baptismal record, or the explicit labeling of a child as filia naturalis, natural son, daughter, was a clear, permanent marker of illegitimacy, a public acknowledgement of sex outside of recognized marriage. This single entry in a parish book, meant to document a blessed event, simultaneously documented a deviation from the sanctioned norm, forever linking the child's identity to their parents' private actions. Talk about being branded from birth, literally in black and white ink. A quirky or fringe tidbit you sometimes find in these records are the vivid, unedited testimonies recorded by the scribes. Witnesses, often illiterate peasants or townsfolk, would speak plainly, using local slang and describing events with surprising detail. Who was seen entering whose house at what hour, sounds heard through thin walls, even specific acts if the court was trying to establish carnal knowledge. These moments offer fleeting, often shocking, glimpses into the lived reality of medieval relationships and sexual encounters, as filtered through the lens of legal investigation and community gossip. They reveal that the authorities weren't shy about trying to get to the bottom of things, no matter how intimate. Historians still argue whether the surviving records paint a complete or distorted picture of medieval sexual behavior. Do the large number of fornication cases reflect widespread premarital sex, or just the efficiency or enthusiasm of local officials in prosecuting it? Are the relatively fewer cases of sodomy evidence that it was rare or that it was incredibly well hidden and severely punished when discovered? It's difficult to know if the records are a mirror reflecting reality or a spotlight illuminating only what the authorities wanted to see or what they were capable of finding. We see who got caught and why, but not the full spectrum of medieval private lives. So when you think about medieval lack of privacy, don't just picture crowded houses and nosy neighbors. Add to that mental image a scribe diligently dipping his quill, recording details about your marriage, your children's legitimacy, or that time you were caught in flagrante delicto. These records transformed fleeting moments of private life into durable public facts, accessible to officials and leaving a legacy for history itself to pick over. Your intimate actions, once documented, became part of a formal public record, forever losing their claim to true privacy. So those official records we were just talking about, the court rolls, the parish registers, all that documentation meticulously noting your life's milestones and mistakes, where do you think all that information came from? It didn't just materialize out of thin air. While some things were self-evident, like a baby being born, though proving paternity was another matter, a huge chunk of the details that ended up making your private life public record came directly from the people living closest to you. Your neighbors, your family, the guy who lived 2 wattle and daub huts down and seemed to know a bit too much about your comings and goings. Medieval society, especially in villages and smaller towns, was incredibly interconnected, both physically and socially. You didn't have fences separating vast yards. You often shared resources: the village well, the communal oven, the open fields you worked side by side. Your houses were small, packed close together, and probably not built with soundproofing in mind. Walls were thin, windows small, and often uncovered. The concept of retreating into a totally private, insulated space was practically non-existent. You were living in a fishbowl, and everyone else was watching. This wasn't just idle curiosity, though there was certainly plenty of that. This constant observation was a fundamental part of social control. In a world without professional police forces as we know them, where formal legal structures could be distant or slow-moving, the immediate community was often the first and most effective line of defense against behavior that deviated from the norm. And guess what deviations they were particularly interested in? Anything that disrupted the social order, which very often included sexual misconduct, marital disputes, or anything that threatened the legitimacy of families and inheritance lines. Imagine living your entire life under the constant, low-level surveillance of everyone you knew. Your neighbors saw who visited your house, when they left, what you were doing or sounded like you were doing inside. If you were a single woman and suddenly looked a bit rounder, everyone noticed. If a married man spent a bit too much time visiting a particular widow, the village grapevine hummed with speculation. These weren't just isolated incidents of gossip. They were part of the very fabric of community life, a collective, decentralized system of monitoring and enforcement. Witnesses in those church court cases we discussed, or in secular court cases dealing with property disputes or breaches of the peace, were almost always your neighbors. They weren't subpoenaed private investigators. They were literally the people living next door who could testify that they saw you doing X, or heard Y, or that the common rumor, fama, in the village was Z. Their testimony, based on observation and local knowledge, was considered valid and crucial evidence. Your private actions, performed within the supposedly safe confines of your home or garden, were actually being logged in the mental databases of your fellow villagers, ready to be retrieved and reported if needed. Think about the dynamic this created. You weren't just worried about divine judgment or formal legal punishment. You were constantly aware that your social standing, your reputation, your very ability to function within the community depended on adhering to shared norms, especially regarding sexual conduct and family life. Step out of line, and you risk not just a fine or a penance, but the cold shoulder, ostracism, or having the rumor mill grind your name into dust. Losing your good name, bona fama, was a serious matter, impacting everything from marriage prospects to business dealings. It's like living in a tiny town where everyone is on Twitter, but instead of 280 characters, they have all day to discuss your questionable choices. Family members also played a critical role in this lack of privacy and enforcement of norms. Marriage was rarely just about romantic love. It was an economic and social contract, often arranged to benefit the wider family. Your choice of partner, your behavior within the marriage, and particularly your ability to produce legitimate heirs, were matters of intense interest and control by your parents, siblings, and extended relatives. They had a vested interest in your conduct, aligning with expectations, and they weren't shy about intervening, applying pressure, or even reporting you to authorities if your actions threatened the family's reputation or inheritance claims. Imagine your medieval Aunt Mildred keeping a close eye on your dating life, ready to inform the parish priest if you even thought about holding hands for the betrothal ceremony. A mainstream historical fact demonstrated by countless sources is the pervasive nature of fama, common rumor or reputation, as a potent force in medieval society and a recognized factor in legal proceedings. Church courts, in particular, often initiated investigations or accepted accusations based purely on fama that someone was living in sin or committing adultery. This wasn't hearsay dismissed out of hand. It was considered evidence of a potential moral failing that the community believed was true and therefore warranted investigation. Your neighbor's whispers could literally land you in court, forcing you to publicly defend yourself against accusations born from gossip and suspicion. This community pressure and constant observation meant that deviations from the norm were not easily hidden. An unmarried woman who became pregnant, for instance, couldn't easily disappear or conceal the pregnancy and birth. The physical signs were obvious, the neighbors were watching, and the eventual arrival of a child with no apparent father was a public event that demanded explanation and often led to formal action by church or secular authorities. Similarly, couples living together outside of marriage were rarely able to do so secretly for long in a close-knit community. Someone would notice, someone would talk, and eventually someone might report them, perhaps hoping for a share of the fine imposed. A quirky or fringe tidbit comes from some court records where neighbors would testify not just about what they saw, but about sounds they heard. There are cases where witnesses claim to have heard groaning, shouting, or other noises emanating from a house that suggested illicit activity was taking place within. These snippets offer a rather awkward and intimate glimpse into the realities of close living and the lengths to which neighbors would go, or were asked to go, in providing testimony. It's like your medieval next-door neighbor being called to court to testify about the sound of your bed springs, which is, well, let's just move on, shall we? Historians still argue whether this community surveillance was primarily a top-down mechanism of control, encouraged by authorities to maintain order, or a more organic, bottom-up expression of community values and mutual policing. Were neighbors reporting each other out of genuine moral conviction, or simply because they were required to? Did people conform out of fear of God and law, or out of fear of their neighbors' wagging tongues and cold shoulders? It's likely a complex mix, but the result was the same. Your actions, particularly those related to sex and family, were under constant scrutiny by the people around you. So while the scribes were busy documenting your life for the official record in the next town over, remember that the information they were writing down was often being generated and verified by the people you saw every single day. Your neighbors, your family, the fellow villagers you shared the harvest with. They were the eyes and ears of the system, making sure that your supposedly private life remained very much a public concern. They were the original social media, just without the filter or the anonymity. Sweet dreams about that. And speaking of your neighbors knowing everything, there was one event in your life that was absolutely, unequivocally designed to be public, witnessed by pretty much everyone. It wasn't just observed by the community, it was created by and for the community, with your individual feelings often taking a back seat. We're talking about getting married. Forget the notion of a quiet, private elopement or a small ceremony with just your closest friends and family. Medieval marriage was a billboard-sized declaration, visible for miles, or at least to everyone in your immediate vicinity. This wasn't because people were nosy, though as we've established, they absolutely were. It was because marriage wasn't just a personal union between two souls. It was a fundamental building block of society, economy, in the church's moral framework. Your marriage determined property rights, established legitimate heirs, forged alliances between families, and was the only sanctioned container for sexual activity. With such high stakes, there was no room for ambiguity or secrecy. The entire community needed to know who was marrying whom, when, and under what terms. The process often started long before the actual wedding day, with the betrothal. This wasn't just a sparkly ring and a change of Facebook status like you might see today. A medieval betrothal, or sponsalia, was a formal, often legally binding agreement, essentially a promise to marry made in the future. It could involve contracts, the exchange of goods or money, like dowry and dower, and crucially, the exchange of vows or promises between the couple, sometimes witnessed by family or friends. In some traditions and time periods, sponsalia per verba de presenti, vows made using present tense, e.g., narration, I take you as my wife, could even be considered a valid, binding marriage in itself, even without a priest or formal ceremony, although this was messy and the church much preferred public, witnessed events. But the point is, even the promise of marriage often had a public dimension, setting the wheels in motion for communal oversight. You couldn't just secretly pinky swear you'd get married someday. You had to make some kind of declaration that signaled your intentions to the wider world. Think about the transition from Section 6, where your neighbors were watching your everyday life. Now imagine adding formal steps that specifically required their attention. Before you could even get to the part about walking down the aisle, or more often, walking to the church door, there was a crucial requirement: the reading of the banns. This is a mainstream historical fact that was absolutely central to medieval marriage procedure across much of Europe. The banns of matrimony were public announcements made in the parish church on 3 consecutive Sundays, or holy days before the intended wedding date. The priest would declare your names and your intention to marry, inviting anyone who knew of any impediment, like a pre-existing marriage being too closely related or having already made vows to someone else, to come forward and object. Why 3 Sundays? To give everyone a chance to hear it. Imagine standing in church trying not to blush while Father Thomas announces to the entire congregation, which was basically everyone in your village, "Be it known that young your name and your intended's name plan to join in holy matrimony on date. If anyone here knows why these two should not be joined, speak now or forever hold your peace." This wasn't whispered, it was announced loudly for all to hear. It was essentially a public audit of your romantic history and family tree, crowdsourced to the entire community. If you had any skeletons in your closet, particularly romantic ones, those 3 weeks were the perfect opportunity for them to rattle loose, probably encouraged by a helpful neighbor with a good memory and perhaps a grudge. It's like your deepest, darkest relationship secrets being broadcast on the local radio station for 3 weeks straight. Good times. The purpose of the bans was explicitly to prevent clandestine or invalid marriages. In a society without centralized records like we have today, relying on community knowledge was the most effective way to ensure that people weren't committing bigamy, marrying their first cousin once removed, a major no-no according to church law, or entering into a marriage that would cause problems down the line. Your neighbors, who knew your business anyway, were deputized as informal watchdogs for the sanctity of marriage. They were expected to pipe up if they knew something was amiss. This ritual reinforced the idea that your decision to marry wasn't just your own. It was subject to community approval and verification. Then came the wedding ceremony itself. While modern weddings are often held inside the church, medieval ceremonies frequently began outside the church door. This wasn't just a stylistic choice, it emphasized that the initial contract was being made in a public space, visible to everyone entering or leaving the church, before the couple proceeded inside for the mass and blessing. The vows you exchanged were spoken aloud, witnessed by those present, family, friends, curious onlookers. The joining of hands, the exchange of rings. These were public symbols of a public covenant. You were literally making your most significant personal commitment on the steps of a public building. for everyone to see and hear. It was less intimate moment and more civic duty performed publicly. After the ceremony, there was often a public procession to the wedding feast, which itself was a large communal event. You'd parade through the village, sometimes with music and dancing, ensuring that nobody missed the fact that you were now a married couple. The feast brought together the families in the community, celebrating and solidifying the new union. The entire process, from the initial betrothal promise to the final wedding festivities, was a sequence of highly visible, public acts meticulously designed to leave no doubt in anyone's mind about your marital status. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on public marriage was primarily driven by the church seeking control over sexual morality and legitimacy, or by secular authorities and families concerned with property rights and social order. Was it about saving your soul or saving your inheritance? Probably a bit of both, woven tightly together in the fabric of medieval life. Regardless of the primary driver, the effect was undeniable. Your transition from single person to married person was a meticulously documented, publicly verified process that left absolutely no room for privacy. Your love life, at its most pivotal moment, became community property, subject to everyone's knowledge and potential commentary. And let's not even get started on the consummation, which in some places and times also had an unnerving lack of privacy, sometimes even involving witnesses. But that's a story for another section. Maybe. Let's just focus on the pre-game show for now. A quirky or fringe tidbit. In some regions, particularly later in the period, there are accounts of hand-fasting ceremonies, which could be a temporary or preliminary form of marriage or betrothal, sometimes lasting a year and a day. While perhaps less formal than a full church wedding, even these agreements involve public vows or exchanges witnessed by others, demonstrating the ingrained need for even less formal unions to have a degree of public acknowledgement. It's like a medieval trial marriage, except everyone knows you're on trial. No pressure. So next time you grumble about having to invite distant relatives to your wedding, just be thankful you weren't required to literally broadcast the banns of your impending doom. I mean marriage to the entire village, and risk having Farmer Giles object because he heard a rumor you once held hands with someone else behind the mill. Your privacy was minimal before marriage, but the act of getting married itself ensured that your new status and the legitimacy of your future children was etched into the collective consciousness of everyone around you. So, you've done it. You've made your vows on the church steps, paraded through the village, probably endured a feast with questionable hygiene standards and copious amounts of weak ale, and finally you are a married person in medieval society. You might think, okay, now that the public spectacle is over, maybe I get a little slice of privacy. Maybe you imagine closing the door of your small home and finally having moments that aren't under the watchful eyes of your neighbors, the priest, or your relatives. Think again, because while the wedding was the announcement of your marital status, life within marriage was still deeply intertwined with the community and its expectations, particularly when it came to the most intimate aspects of your union. Your bedroom, or more likely, the shared space where your bed was located within your single-room dwelling, was still part of a larger social ecosystem that demanded accountability and visibility, even in matters we would consider intensely private today. The biggest reason for this continued surveillance: procreation. Medieval society, heavily influenced by the church, viewed marriage primarily as a legitimate context for producing children. This wasn't just a personal preference, it was a social and religious imperative. Children were future laborers, potential heirs, and souls to be guided towards salvation. A marriage that produced children was fulfilling its primary purpose in the eyes of God and man. A marriage that didn't, well, that raised eyebrows. Your fertility or lack thereof was not just a matter for you and your spouse. It was a topic of community interest and sometimes intervention. If you didn't conceive relatively soon after marriage, whispers might start. Was one of you infertile? Was there something wrong with the union? Were you perhaps engaging in non-procreative sexual acts, which the church considered sinful? These weren't hushed conversations behind cupped hands. These were matters discussed openly, and sometimes brought before ecclesiastical courts if concerns became serious. Your ability to get pregnant or father a child was effectively public data points that your neighbors were tracking. And when you did get pregnant, guess what? That was even more public. There were no discreet ultrasound scans or private appointments with an obstetrician. Your changing body was visible to everyone around you. Your morning sickness, which, let's be honest, probably wasn't discreetly managed anyway, was witnessed. Pregnancy wasn't just a biological state, it was a social event, a public declaration of a marriage's success. You might receive advice, solicited or otherwise, from every older woman in the village, along with their homespun remedies and superstitions. They were invested in your pregnancy because it represented the continuation of the community itself. The birth itself was a communal affair. It wasn't a private hospital room with just your partner present. Births typically took place at home, attended by midwives and often several other women from the community. Neighbors, relatives, friends. These women provided support, yes, but they also served as witnesses. They were there to ensure the birth was legitimate, that the child was healthy, or to attest if it wasn't, and to participate in the rituals surrounding childbirth. As privacy, forget it. You were in labor with an audience. It's like a reality TV show, but instead of cameras, you just have Margaret from down the lane judging your pain tolerance. This public aspect extended even to marital relations themselves. The church had quite a lot to say about when, how, and why married couples could have sex. Sex was primarily sanctioned for procreation. Sexual acts deemed non-procreative, like contraception or certain positions, were considered sinful. There were also prohibitions on sex during certain holy days, Sundays, Lent, Advent, and other fasting periods. That's a lot of days off. While obviously no one was literally in your bedroom policing your behavior every night, thankfully that's a line even medieval society didn't fully cross, the potential for community or church oversight influenced behavior. Confession provided a mechanism for reporting on your private sins, including those within marriage, to the priest. And priests, being members of the community themselves, were often well aware of local gossip and dynamics. A mainstream historical fact here: confession, as mandated by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, requiring annual confession for all adult Christians, played a significant role in bringing private behavior, including sexual conduct within marriage, under the scrutiny of the church. You were expected to confess your sins, and sexual sins were a major category. This created a system where private actions were revealed to an authority figure who represented both God and the community's moral standards. It was like having to report your browser history to your boss every year. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on procreation and the regulation of marital sex was more about controlling individual behavior and enforcing religious doctrine, or about ensuring social stability and the legitimate transfer of property through clear lineage. Was the church more concerned with your soul or your family tree? Like many things, it was likely a complex interplay of both. A quirky or fringe tidbit: there are mentions in medieval texts, particularly penitentials, manuals for confessors, of surprisingly specific questions priests were encouraged to ask about sexual practices within marriage to root out sin. Some of these questions are quite explicit, suggesting that the church's interest in your private life went into rather detailed territory. Far beyond simple, "Did you have sex?" Imagine trying to explain that to Father Michael. So even when the door was closed, your marital life was never truly private. Your neighbors watched for signs of pregnancy, attended your labor, and knew if your marriage was blessed with children. The church set rules for your intimate life and expected you to confess deviations. Your productivity as a married unit was a matter of public concern. It's almost enough to make you want to just stay single, isn't it? Though, as we've seen, single life had its own set of public challenges. It seems medieval society was just determined to know everything about you, one way or another. So you see, even your most intimate moments within the sanctity, or lack thereof, of your marriage weren't truly your own. The eyes of the community, the expectations of the church, and the sheer biological reality of procreation made sure of that. But it wasn't just marital relations or the anticipation of offspring that stripped away modern notions of privacy. Your entire life from dawn till dusk was an open book, or perhaps more accurately, an open-air theater with everyone playing both actor and critic. Let's talk about your home. When we picture a medieval home, we might think of a cozy cottage with thick walls and a sturdy door. And yes, there was a door, but in many smaller villages and hamlets, especially for the common folk, homes were single-room dwellings, maybe with a loft space if you were lucky. And these homes were often clustered together, very, very close together. We're talking shared walls, windows facing directly into a neighbor's window just a few feet away, or doors that stood open much of the day because, frankly, it was stuffy inside and you needed the light. Imagine trying to have a private conversation when the sound of your voice carries easily through thin walls or an open doorway to the family living right next door. Imagine trying to argue with your spouse, discipline your children, or even just sit quietly and think when the sights and sounds of your domestic life are constantly visible and audible to those around you. There was no retreating to separate bedrooms or a quiet study. Your living space was a permeable boundary, constantly interacting with the public space of the village path or communal yard. And your neighbors? Oh, your neighbors were everything. They weren't just the people who lived near you. They were your social safety net, your labor exchange partners, your gossip network, and your personal surveillance system all rolled into one. They saw you leave in the morning for the fields or the market. They saw who visited you, if anyone. They heard your arguments. They knew when you were sick. They knew when you were celebrating. They knew, often in excruciating detail, the rhythms and events of your life because their lives were equally intertwined with yours, physically and socially. It's like living in a reality show house, but with livestock and slightly less plumbing. And no prize money, just the constant pressure of societal norms. Gossip wasn't just idle chatter. It was a vital mechanism of information flow and social control. News traveled fast in a pre-literate society without mass media. How else would you know if someone was breaking community rules, if there was a new arrival, or if old man Fitzwilliam's cow had finally stopped giving milk? Information about everyone was collectively held. Your reputation wasn't something you carefully curated online. It was built and maintained or destroyed through face-to-mouth communication in the village square, at the well, or during communal work. Was she a hard worker? Was he honest? Were they keeping their house tidy? Did she complain too much? All this was public knowledge, openly discussed and evaluated. Your social credit score was literally just what your neighbors thought of you, and they thought a lot. This intense proximity and visibility meant that deviating from norms was incredibly difficult. If you were lazy, everyone saw it. If you were promiscuous, everyone knew it or suspected it very loudly. If you were arguing with your wife, the whole street heard it. There was no anonymity, no way to disappear into a crowd or shield your behavior behind closed doors. The constant awareness of being watched, of being known, acted as a powerful constraint on individual behavior. You behaved not just because of laws or religious doctrine, but because Mrs. Higgins from next door would definitely tell everyone if you didn't. And her judgment was often more immediate and impactful than divine retribution. Consider the necessities of life. You didn't have your own private well in your backyard, your own private oven, or often even your own private patch of woodland for fuel. You used the communal well, the communal oven, often located in the village center, and shared common lands for grazing animals or collecting wood. Going to the well meant interacting with others. Baking bread in the communal oven meant waiting your turn, chatting with neighbors, and having everyone see how much flour you had, how many loaves you were making, and perhaps even critiquing the look of your dough. These were not solitary chores. They were social events, more opportunities for observation and interaction. It's like going to the laundromat, but if the laundromat was also the only place to get water and everyone knew exactly how many pairs of socks you owned. Even something as basic as sanitation was often a public and frankly rather unpleasant affair. While some homes might have had a small privy, many people used communal facilities or simply went to designated areas outside the village perimeter. This wasn't exactly a private bathroom experience. And the smells of a medieval village. Animal waste, human waste, cooking fires, stagnant water, tanning hides, blacksmiths. It was a constant, pervasive olfactory assault that blended personal and communal realities into one unavoidable experience. You couldn't escape the sensory presence of your neighbors, and they couldn't escape yours. Your personal space literally smelled like everyone else's. A mainstream historical fact relevant here is the manorial system and village organization. In many parts of medieval Europe, particularly in England, people lived in villages that were part of a manor. Land was often held in common fields, cultivated collectively or in strips by individual families. Housing was clustered together, usually near the church and manor house. This physical layout inherently promoted close proximity and interdependence, making private, isolated living virtually impossible for the vast majority of the population. Your work was often done alongside neighbors, your land bordered theirs, and your home was part of a dense cluster. Historians still argue whether this pervasive lack of privacy was primarily a consequence of technological limitations and economic necessity. Everyone needed to share resources like ovens and wells, or if it was a deliberate feature of a society that prioritized community cohesion and social control over individual autonomy. Was it about necessity or philosophy? Probably a bit of both, because life is rarely simple enough for just one reason, is it? Necessity certainly forced people into close quarters, but the social structures that developed around that proximity seem to have actively leveraged the lack of privacy for community management. A quirky or fringe tidbit: in some medieval towns, there were actually bylaws regulating neighborly disputes that arose from things like leaning ladders against a neighbor's wall without permission, or allowing eaves to drip water onto their property. The level of detail in these regulations shows just how intertwined and potentially conflict-ridden close living could be, requiring formal rules for even minor intrusions on someone's minimal space. They literally had rules about where your roof drip could land. That's peak close quarters living. This constant visibility meant that maintaining a good reputation was paramount. Your reputation affected your ability to trade, to find help when you needed it, to marry off your children, and to generally navigate life. A bad reputation could be devastating, leading to social exclusion or even formal punishment. Because everyone knew your business, any perceived failing or sin was immediately amplified through the gossip network. It was like living under constant peer review, except the reviewers were everyone you knew, and their comments were shouted across the village green. Even seemingly minor things like how you dressed, how you spoke, or how you kept your small garden were subject to community scrutiny and comment. Did you dress above your station? Were you too loud or too quiet? Was your garden patch neglected? These weren't just personal choices. They were public statements about your character and your adherence to community expectations. There was very little room for eccentricities or for forging your own path away from the collective norms. Unless your path involved walking down the only path everyone else used anyway. So while the church regulated your bedroom and your soul, your neighbors regulated your daily life, your reputation, and pretty much everything else in between. The physical layout of villages, the reliance on communal resources, the centrality of gossip as an information network, and the sheer lack of personal enclosed space meant that privacy as we understand it today was simply not a concept that applied to the vast majority of medieval people. Your life was, by necessity and by design, lived very much in public. There was no going off-grid. The grid was the village, and everyone was plugged in, whether they liked it or not. It's a wonder anyone managed to keep a secret, or even just have a quiet moment to themselves, isn't it? It seems the biggest luxury wasn't gold or land, but maybe just 5 minutes alone with your own thoughts, uninterrupted by a neighbor asking if you'd heard about what Mildred was wearing to Mass last Sunday. So while your neighbors acted as a kind of organic distributed surveillance network, keeping tabs on your every move and judging your compliance with community standards, there was another, even more powerful institution with its own set of rules and its own methods for getting into the details of your life: the church. If the village was the neighborhood watch, the church was the all-seeing eye, not just concerned with your physical actions, but with the state of your immortal soul. And getting into the state of your soul often meant getting into the nitty-gritty of your private life, including your sexual activities and thoughts. The primary tool the church used to penetrate your personal space, both literally and figuratively, was the sacrament of confession. This wasn't just a casual chat with the priest about feeling a bit guilty. It was a formal requirement, a ritual designed to cleanse your soul of sin and reconcile you with God and the Christian community. And it wasn't optional, at least not after a certain point. In the early 13th century, specifically at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the church made it mandatory for all adult Christians to confess their sins at least once a year, usually before Easter, and to receive communion. This is a mainstream historical fact. It codified and enforced a practice that had been developing for centuries. Suddenly, everyone, from the highest lord to the lowest peasant, had to sit down and spill their secrets to a priest. It was like a universal mandatory performance review. But the boss was God, and the HR rep was a guy in a robe who lived down the street. Imagine sitting there in the dim light of the church, kneeling before your priest, often someone you knew, who knew your family, who saw you in the market just yesterday. You had to list your sins, all of them, not just the big ones, but the small ones too. And the church had developed incredibly detailed lists and manuals for priests outlining every conceivable type of sin, including a significant focus on sexual transgressions. These manuals would cover everything from simple fornication or adultery to more unnatural acts, a broad and often vaguely defined category, and even sinful thoughts. You couldn't just say, "I sinned." You had to confess the specifics. How many times, with whom, under what circumstances. It was, in essence, a forced disclosure of your most private actions and thoughts. You were basically downloading your entire browsing history directly to your priest, live and in person. And no, there was no incognito mode. The priest's role wasn't just passive listening. He was trained to probe, to ask questions, to make sure you weren't holding anything back. He was your confessor, yes, but also a sort of spiritual interrogator. If you were vague, he might press you for details. If you omitted something important, he might even accuse you, relying on gossip he'd heard or observations he'd made. And based on your confession, he would assign penance, a punishment or act of atonement designed to help you make amends for your sins. This penance could range from saying specific prayers, fasting, giving to the poor, going on pilgrimage, or, for more serious or persistent sins, even public humiliation or physical punishments. The priest, therefore, held considerable power over your spiritual well-being, and through the penance he assigned, could influence your daily life in very tangible ways. He was like a life coach, but instead of helping you find your passion, he helped you find ways to suffer for your mistakes. This system meant that the priest in a village or parish had an unparalleled level of insight into the private lives of everyone in his flock. He knew who was having an affair, who was arguing with their spouse, who was greedy, who was lying, who was struggling with lustful thoughts, and yes, who was engaging in sexual activity outside of sanctioned marriage, and with whom. While the seal of the confessional was, in theory, supposed to protect the secrecy of what was confessed, the priest still knew. And while he might not be allowed to directly reveal what he learned in confession, that knowledge undoubtedly informed his interactions with his parishioners and his understanding of the community dynamics. Think of it as having a therapist who isn't allowed to tell anyone exactly what you said, but whose face clearly reads, "Oh, so that's why you act like that," every time they see you in public. Beyond confession, the church had other mechanisms for policing morality that dragged private matters into the public sphere. Church courts, for example, dealt with a range of issues that we might consider private today, including marital disputes, cases of adultery or fornication, accusations of witchcraft, which often involved alleged private pacts or activities, and violations of religious law, like working on the Sabbath or failing to attend church. These courts could compel attendance, take testimony, which might involve neighbors or family members revealing private information, and impose penalties, including fines, excommunication, a terrifying prospect that cut you off from the community in the hope of salvation, or public penance. Imagine being found guilty of adultery in a church court. Your penance might involve standing outside the church door during Mass, wearing a special penitential garment, in publicly declaring your sin to everyone entering, or perhaps being forced to walk through the village being whipped, or performing other humiliating public acts. This wasn't just a private spiritual reckoning, it was a public performance of shame designed to deter others and reinforce community norms. Your private sin became a public spectacle, broadcast for the entire village to see and learn from. It was the ultimate walk of shame, centuries before reality TV made it a punchline. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this policing is the existence of detailed confession manuals for priests. Some of these were incredibly specific in cataloging potential sins, including highly unusual or even bizarre sexual acts, drawing on various theological interpretations and even folk beliefs. Some historians suggest these manuals might reveal more about the anxieties and imaginations of the clerics who wrote them than about the actual prevalence of certain sins among the common populace. Nevertheless, they show the church's deep, if sometimes strange, interest in cataloging and controlling private behavior. It's like finding a government handbook from the 15th century that includes tax codes for unicorn farming. Fascinating, but maybe not a reflection of everyday life. Historians still argue whether the church's moral policing, through confession and courts, was genuinely effective in changing people's behavior, or if it primarily served to reinforce social hierarchies and provide an avenue for settling personal scores under the guise of religious piety. Did it truly make people more virtuous, or did it just make them better at hiding their sins, or perhaps more resentful of the intrusion? It's hard to measure virtue across centuries, isn't it? The point is, the church, with its mandatory confession, its probing priests, its detailed sin catalogs, and its public court system, created a formal, institutional structure that demanded access to your private thoughts and actions. Combined with the intense physical proximity and social scrutiny of village life, this religious oversight left very little room for personal privacy, especially regarding matters of sex and morality. Your soul was the church's business, and since your actions determined the fate of your soul, your actions, no matter how private they felt, became their business too. It was just another layer added on top of your nosy neighbors, ensuring that you lived your life under constant observation and judgment. Sweet dreams, right? So you had your nosy neighbors, always watching, always judging, making sure you weren't stepping out of line with community expectations. And you had the church, with its mandatory confessionals and probing questions, getting into the details of your soul, which inevitably meant getting into the details of your actions, including the ones you really, really wanted to keep private. But what happened when you, despite all this scrutiny, decided to engage in sex outside the confines of approved, church-sanctioned, community-witnessed marriage? Well, that wasn't just a personal matter you confessed away. It was often something that spilled out into the public sphere with potentially harsh consequences. Medieval society, deeply intertwined with Christian morality, considered sex outside marriage, whether it was fornication between unmarried people or adultery involving at least one married person, not just a sin, but a social disorder and often a crime. It was seen as a threat to the established order, to family honor, to legitimate inheritance, and to the moral purity of the community. Therefore, it wasn't just the priest you had to worry about. Local officials, manorial lords, and secular courts also took an interest, often working in concert with or parallel to the church courts we talked about. This was a societal problem, and society that was determined to know about it and deal with it. How did they find out? Often through the very mechanisms we've already discussed, your neighbors. If you were sneaking around, someone saw you, someone heard something, someone noticed a pattern, a late-night visit, a whispered conversation, perhaps even the telltale signs of a pregnancy out of wedlock. That information, that gossip that permeated the village air like the smell of pig manure, could easily transition from hushed whispers over the washing trough to formal accusations brought before the manorial court or the church court. People had incentives to report you too, beyond simple moral outrage. Sometimes there were fines involved, and the informer might get a cut. Or it might be a way to settle an old score. Oh, you think I'm lazy? Well, let's see what the court thinks about you and the miller's wife behind the barns last Tuesday. It was like an early version of a report a problem button, but the problem was your love life, and the report went straight to the authorities, filed by Brenda from down the lane. Once an accusation was made, it triggered a process. You might be summoned before the court. Witnesses would be called, often your neighbors again, forced or sometimes eager to testify about what they saw or heard. Remember how there was nowhere to hide? This is where that physical proximity became a legal liability. Your house was small, but so was your world, and everyone in it was potentially a witness for or against you. Imagine having your most intimate moments, or alleged moments, dissected in public with the butcher, the baker, and the candle maker all listening intently from the back of the courtroom. It was less like a court proceeding and more like a particularly awkward village hall meeting about your underwear drawer. And the punishments were designed specifically to make your private misstep a very public lesson. Fines were common, hitting your purse strings directly. But more significantly, punishments often involve public humiliation. You might be ordered to stand in the stocks in the market square, an object of mockery and scorn for everyone passing by. Or perhaps you'd be forced to wear a specific mark or garment identifying you as an adulterer or fornicator. In some places, public penance was required, which could involve walking through the village or town in a humiliating manner, perhaps barefoot or carrying a candle, confessing your sin aloud at various points, often while being jeered at or even pelted with rotten vegetables. This was not about discreetly correcting your behavior. It was about making an example of you. Your shame was the community's entertainment and moral instruction. Adultery, particularly for women, was often viewed more severely than simple fornication. A married woman's adultery could call the legitimacy of her husband's children into question, threatening the inheritance and social order. While men were punished, the societal and legal weight often fell more heavily on women in these cases. This is a mainstream historical fact. Medieval laws and social customs generally imposed stricter penalties and greater shame on women involved in illicit sex than on men. This wasn't exactly gender equality in sin. A quirky or fringe tidbit involves some of the more unusual punishments recorded in local court rolls. In some areas, particularly for repeated offenders or more scandalous cases, you might be subjected to a cucking stool or ducking stool, originally used for scolds but sometimes applied to sexual offenders, involving being strapped to a chair and publicly submerged in water. Or you might face banishment from the village or town, effectively making you a homeless pariah. Some manorial courts even had bylaws specifying exactly what activities were forbidden and what the fine was, sometimes listing specific locations within the manor where illicit sex was known to occur, like behind the Lord's barn, apparently a popular spot. Historians still argue whether the primary goal of these public punishments was truly moral reformation or social control. Were they genuinely trying to save your soul and deter you from future sin? Or were they simply reinforcing power structures, generating revenue from fines, and providing a public spectacle that reminded everyone else to stay in line? It's a debate about intent versus impact. And since we can't exactly interview a medieval villager after they've spent a day in the stocks, it's tough to know for sure how it felt on the receiving end. What is clear, however, is that if you engaged in sexual activity outside of marriage in medieval times, you ran a significant risk that your actions would be discovered, reported, investigated, and punished in a manner that dragged your most private moments into the harsh light of public scrutiny. The policing of illicit sex was a prime example of how the lines between personal behavior and public concern were virtually non-existent. Your body, your desires, and your relationships weren't entirely your own business. They were also the business of your neighbors, your church, your Lord, and your community. It was just one more way your life was an open book, whether you wanted it to be or not. So you've seen how your neighbors were watching, how the church was listening, and how the courts were ready to drag your love life into the public square for everyone to gawk at and judge. It wasn't a discreet affair, not even close. But did everyone face the same level of scrutiny, the same kind of punishment? Not exactly. Medieval society was rigidly hierarchical, and who you were, your gender, your social class, your profession, especially if that profession involved vows of celibacy, significantly impacted how your sex life or perceived sex life was policed and punished. The lack of privacy was universal, yes, but the consequences of that lack could differ dramatically depending on your place in the social ladder. Let's start with gender, which was perhaps the most significant differentiator. As we touched upon, women generally faced harsher judgment and consequences for sexual transgressions than men. This wasn't just about perceived morality, it was deeply rooted in property, inheritance, and the patriarchal structure of society. A man's sexual activity, while perhaps sinful according to the church, didn't typically threaten the legitimacy of his heirs or the family's property lines in the same way a woman's could. If a married woman had sex with someone other than her husband, any child born could be deemed illegitimate, potentially disinheriting the rightful heirs and causing chaos in land transfer and family lineage. This practical concern, combined with deeply ingrained misogyny and the Virgin Mary/Eve dichotomy, meant that female sexuality was heavily controlled and policed. A mainstream historical fact is that adultery laws and social customs across medieval Europe consistently punished women more severely than men for the same act. A man might be fined or undergo public penance, but a woman could face steeper fines, harsher public shaming, loss of her dowry, divorce initiated by her husband, often without the ability to remarry or retain custody of children, and in some extreme or noble cases, even imprisonment or death. Though execution for adultery was relatively rare compared to, say, heresy or treason. Think of it as a disproportionate response. He gets a slap on the wrist and a sermon. She gets banished from the village and her reputation permanently ruined. It's almost like their society had an internal threat assessment system, and women's sexuality registered as a higher risk to the established order. Then there was class. If you were a peasant, your life was largely governed by manorial courts and local customs, in addition to the omnipresent church courts. Your lord had jurisdiction over many aspects of your life, including moral behavior that affected the stability of his manor. Fines levied in manorial courts for fornication or adultery were a source of income for the lord. So while your neighbor's gossip might initiate the process, the lord's administrative machine and desire for revenue kept the wheels turning. Your lack of privacy was profitable for someone else. If you were part of the merchant class in a town or city, you might fall under the jurisdiction of urban courts or guild regulations, which could also have rules regarding sexual behavior, often linked to maintaining the reputation of the guild or the town. For the nobility, while their scandals might be whispered about in castles and reported in chronicles, they often had more resources to navigate or mitigate the consequences of their actions. They could appeal to higher courts, leverage political connections, or negotiate with the church. That's not to say they were immune. Noblewomen especially were under immense pressure to maintain purity for dynastic reasons, and their marriages and reproductive lives were intensely public matters of state. Remember Eleanor of Aquitaine? Her marriages and potential inability to produce male heirs were topics of international political discussion. Your sex life could literally be foreign policy if you were important enough. That's a whole other level of everyone knows your business. Now let's talk about the clergy. This group, who were supposedly the moral compass of society and had taken vows of celibacy, presented a unique paradox. The church preached abstinence outside marriage and the sanctity of marital sex, but its own members were formally forbidden from any sex. This created a situation ripe for hypocrisy, scandal, and intense public scrutiny. While the church ideally handled transgressions within its own ranks through ecclesiastical courts and internal discipline, the reality was far messier. Priests, monks, and nuns were part of communities, and their deviations from celibacy were often highly visible, leading to gossip, complaints from parishioners or neighbors, and sometimes intervention from secular authorities concerned about the moral state of their region. A quirky or fringe tidbit here involves the phenomenon of clerical concubinage. Despite the official stance of celibacy, many priests in practice lived with women, often in long-term, stable relationships that were essentially marriages in all but name and church sanction. Sometimes these relationships were tolerated by the community or even the bishops, especially in rural areas where finding priests was difficult and a resident priest's wife might perform valuable community roles. Other times, these women and their children were subjected to harassment, legal challenges, and social ostracism. The church periodically launched campaigns to enforce celibacy, leading to investigations that were essentially forced invasions of privacy, with bishops inquiring into priests' living situations and relationships. It was a constant tension between the church's ideal and the human reality on the ground. And the private lives of clergy were perpetually caught in the middle. Historians still argue whether the widespread nature of clerical concubinage indicates that celibacy was largely unenforceable, or that the church's attempts to enforce it, however inconsistent, significantly shaped the lives and public perceptions of the clergy. Was it a system of official prohibition tempered by widespread tacit acceptance? Or was it a constant source of low-level conflict and scandal that kept the issue of clerical sexual behavior firmly in the public eye? It's difficult to gauge the level of community acceptance versus quiet disapproval from the available records, which often focus on the moments when the system broke down and reached the courts. Ultimately, your social standing didn't grant you privacy regarding your sexual conduct. It simply changed the rules of the non-existent game. Whether you were a peasant woman facing a public dunking, a nobleman whose marriage was a political tool, or a priest whose companion was an open secret, your intimate life was a matter of public concern, subject to the rules and judgments of your specific social sphere. The rigid layers of medieval society didn't create private pockets. They just multiplied the number of people and institutions who felt they had a right to know your business and police your behavior. And that, perhaps more than anything, tells you just how different their world was from ours when it came to drawing lines around personal life. So you're living in this intensely physical, intensely observed world we've been exploring. Your home is basically a semi-permeable membrane, the village is a constant stage, and the church has a direct hotline to your soul's filing cabinet via the confessional. But there's another layer, perhaps less formal than the priest or the court, but often just as powerful, if not more so. The relentless, buzzing, inescapable force of community gossip. This wasn't just background noise in medieval life. It was a crucial, active mechanism of social control, enforcing norms, punishing transgressions, and shaping your reputation in ways that could make or break your existence. Imagine your life as a play being performed constantly in the village square. Everyone is watching. Everyone has an opinion. And unlike online comment sections today, where you can often hide behind an avatar, here, everyone knows exactly who you are, who your family is, and where you live. There's no anonymity button when your home is a single room opening onto the street and your neighbors are literally pressing their ears against the flimsy wall or just hearing everything through the open window. Every argument, every visitor at an unusual hour, every time you stumble home a little too merry from the alehouse, it's all public information, fed into the community grapevine. And that grapevine was fast. In a world without mass media, news, information, and crucially, rumor traveled by word of mouth. And it traveled with astonishing speed within a tightly knit community. Gatherings at the well, conversations at the market stalls, shared work in the fields or the workshop, evenings spent huddled together for warmth and company. These were the conduits through which information, observation, and interpretation flowed. If you did something slightly outside the norm, something that raised an eyebrow, you could be sure that by the time the sun set, half the village would have heard about it, and the other half by sunrise. It was the original, organic, always-on social media network, except everyone was a verified account and there was no block function. The stakes for maintaining a good reputation were incredibly high. Unlike today, where you might move cities, change jobs, or reinvent yourself online, your medieval identity was deeply rooted in your community standing. Your reputation affected your ability to trade, to borrow money, to find a suitable spouse for yourself or your children, to participate fully in community life, and even to be believed in court. A good name was perhaps your most valuable asset, painstakingly built over years, and easily shattered by a single scandal or persistent rumor. And nowhere was reputation more fragile and more fiercely guarded than around matters of sexual behavior and marital fidelity. Gossip about sex wasn't just titillating, it was often a direct judgment on your adherence to community standards and church teachings. Were you suspected of keeping company with someone you shouldn't be? Was your wife rumored to be spending time alone with a traveling merchant? Did whispers circulate about the legitimacy of your youngest child? Was your husband accused of visiting the local prostitute? Or perhaps more commonly and accepted but still a source of gossip, of having an ongoing relationship with a widowed neighbor? These weren't just private matters, they were infractions against the social and moral order of the community. Consider the impact of being labeled unchaste or adulterous or simply not respectable. For a young woman, such a reputation could make marriage impossible, condemning her to a precarious future. For a married woman, it could lead to ostracization, abuse from her husband, often implicitly condoned by the community if the gossip was believed, or even legal repercussions in the church courts we discussed earlier. For a man, while sexual transgressions were sometimes viewed with slightly more leniency, a double standard that historians still grapple with, accusations of infidelity or impropriety could still damage his standing, particularly if he was a man of some status or if his behavior disrupted social harmony. The power of gossip lay in its ability to create a shared narrative, a communal truth that might or might not align perfectly with reality. Once a rumor took hold, it was incredibly difficult to shake off. People would interpret your actions through the lens of the gossip they'd heard. That innocent conversation with the baker? See? Told you she was flirting. That late-night visit to a sick relative? Clearly covering for something else. The lines between fact, speculation, and outright malice blurred constantly in the echo chamber of community whispers. A mainstream historical fact highlighting this is the role of community testimony in formal legal settings. Medieval courts, both secular and ecclesiastical, frequently relied on the sworn testimony of neighbors to ascertain the truth of a matter. Your reputation, built and reinforced through daily interactions, and the associated gossip could be presented as evidence for or against you. If you were accused of a crime or a moral transgression, your neighbors might be called upon to testify to your character. If the general consensus, shaped by years of observation and gossip, was that you were a trustworthy, respectable person, this could weigh heavily in your favor. Conversely, if the community grapevine had long painted you as unreliable, dishonest, or morally suspect, this could be devastating to your case, even if there was little hard evidence against you. Your public persona, sculpted by the collective perception of your neighbors, was a tangible factor in the justice system. This communal pressure wasn't just about punishing bad behavior. It was also about enforcing conformity and maintaining social cohesion. Gossip served as a constant reminder of the expected norms. You learned what was acceptable and what wasn't by observing who was talked about and in what way. The fear of becoming the subject of negative gossip was a powerful incentive to stick to the straight and narrow, or at least to be incredibly discreet about any deviations, which, as we've established, was practically impossible anyway. It's a bit like living under constant review for a reality show you didn't sign up for, except the judges are everyone you know, and the prize for failure is public humiliation and social exclusion. A quirky or fringe tidbit that illustrates the creativity of medieval gossip culture is the use of charivari. This wasn't purely gossip, but it was a public ritual directly stemming from community disapproval, often fueled by rumor and observation, particularly around disapproved marriages, like a very old man marrying a very young woman, or a widow remarrying too quickly, or perceived marital disharmony. If a couple's behavior, perhaps relating to their conjugal duties or fidelity, became the subject of widespread negative gossip and community resentment, their neighbors might organize a charivari. This involved gathering outside the couple's house at night, making a tremendous amount of noise with pots, pans, horns, and shouting, often accompanied by mocking songs or rhymes that explicitly detailed the perceived transgression. It was a raucous, humiliating public demonstration of disapproval designed to shame the couple into conforming. It wasn't formal justice, but it was a potent form of community justice, showing just how far neighbors would go to police private behavior that they felt impacted the collective moral fabric. Imagine your neighbors gathering outside your bedroom window with cowbells because they suspect you're not doing your part to replenish the village population. Gives noisy neighbors a whole new meaning, doesn't it? Historians still debate the extent to which gossip was genuinely about upholding shared moral values versus being a tool for settling personal scores, expressing envy, or maintaining power dynamics within the community. Was it a sincere effort to keep the community pure in the eyes of God and tradition? Or was it often weaponized by individuals or factions against their rivals? It's likely both, a complex interplay of genuine moral concern, social pressure, and human fallibility. Sorting out the motivations behind a 1,000-year-old whisper network is tricky business, but it's clear that the effect was a pervasive sense of being watched, judged, and held accountable not just by authorities, but by everyone around you. The sheer volume and detail of surviving records that mention community disputes, accusations of slander, and court cases initiated based on neighborly complaints attest to the fact that gossip wasn't just idle chatter. It had real teeth. People lived in constant awareness that their actions, their relationships, and particularly their sexual conduct were under scrutiny by their peers. This fostered a climate of caution and conformity, where maintaining appearances and avoiding scandal were paramount concerns. You learned to be careful about who you were seen with, where you went, and what was heard or rumored to be heard emanating from your home. This informal, peer-to-peer surveillance network complemented the formal structures of the church and, to a lesser extent, secular law, where the church courts might step in for serious proven transgressions. Gossip policed the gray areas, the suspicions, and the minor deviations. It created a low-level hum of accountability that was always present, always judging. You might manage to hide something from the priest in confession, though that risked eternal damnation. And you might avoid the formal courts if your transgression wasn't serious enough or couldn't be proven. But you could rarely escape the judgment of your neighbors, delivered through whispers, knowing glances, and a slowly curdling reputation. So, think about your medieval self navigating this world. You're packed cheek by jowl with your family and neighbors. The walls offer no real barrier. Your daily activities are visible to all. The church wants to know your deepest secrets, especially the ones involving sex, and is happy to make your penance public. And on top of all that, everyone you know is constantly observing you, talking about you, judging you, and ready to use their collective voice, the voice of gossip, to enforce the unwritten rules of the community. Your sexual privacy wasn't just absent, it was actively dismantled, brick by brick, or maybe mud and wattle by mud and wattle, by the physical environment, the social structure, the religious authority, and the ceaseless murmur of your neighbor's opinions. It makes you appreciate the blessed anonymity of a busy street or the mute button on a conference call, doesn't it? This intricate web of observation, judgment, and rumor meant that the concept of personal, private sexual space or activity, free from external knowledge or commentary, was practically non-existent. Your sex life, like so many other aspects of your existence, was inextricably bound up with the collective life of the community, subject to its rules, its judgments, and its ceaseless fascination. So you're navigating this medieval world where privacy is already a foreign concept. Your home is open, your village is watching, and your neighbors are the most dedicated gossip columnists you could ever imagine. Every cough, every argument, every slightly too long glance between unmarried individuals is grist for the mill. But beyond the whispers and the knowing looks, beyond the charivari drumming outside your window, there was a formal system waiting to step in if your behavior strayed too far from the accepted path. If community pressure wasn't enough to police your intimate life, the law, or more often, the church, had ways to make your private business very, very public. Forget everything you think you know about courts today, where there's a clear separation between civil and criminal law, and where personal morality is generally kept out of the courtroom unless it directly impacts a specific statute. In medieval times, especially in the realm of anything vaguely related to sin or the proper ordering of society, the church's legal system, the ecclesiastical courts, held immense power. These weren't just courts for priests and bishops. They were courts for everyone. And they were very interested in your soul, your behavior, and yes, your sex life. Imagine sitting on a hard wooden bench in a chilly, perhaps slightly damp church building or chapter house. Before you sits a judge, usually a cleric, surrounded by scribes and officials. This isn't about who stole a chicken or disputed a land boundary, though they might handle some of that too. This is about your immortal soul, as interpreted through your very mortal actions. And often, you are there because someone, maybe your parish priest, maybe a nosy neighbor, maybe even your own spouse, has formally accused you of a moral transgression. The list of potential charges handled by these courts was long and fascinatingly detailed. Fornication, sex outside of marriage? Absolutely. Adultery? A major no-no, often treated more severely if committed by a woman than a man, because patriarchy. Bigamy? A definite crime. Incest? Horrifying and legally actionable. But they also delved into issues you might think were purely domestic or personal: marital disputes, failure to pay tithes, breaking oaths, working on Sundays, and a whole range of sexual missteps that didn't fit neatly into the major sin categories. They even dealt with things like scolding wives or husbands who mistreated their spouses, although the standards for what constituted mistreatment could vary wildly. How did you end up in this position? Well, you could be formally denounced by someone in the community, perhaps a church warden or a neighbor who had a grudge, or genuinely believed they were doing God's work. The priest might bring charges based on what he observed or what he heard, including, yes, gossip. Sometimes cases arose from disputes within families or between individuals. And rather surprisingly, from a modern perspective, people sometimes voluntarily appeared before the court to confess a transgression before they were caught, hoping for a lighter penance. Imagine walking into court today and saying, "Yes, Your Honor, I did sneak that extra biscuit from the office kitchen. Please give me my punishment." It just doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? The court proceedings themselves further stripped away any semblance of privacy. While not always open to the entire public in the way a market square was, these were formal legal processes involving witnesses and testimony. If you were accused, your neighbors might be called upon to testify not just about the specific incident in question, but about your general character and reputation. Remember that community grapevine? Its output could be used as evidence against you. Sworn oaths were a critical part of the process. Lying under oath was a grave sin, so the court placed great weight on what people were willing to swear to. This meant your private actions were being dissected and discussed under oath by people you knew in a semi-public forum. Let's say you were accused of fornication with someone who was not your spouse. Witnesses might testify to seeing you together at unusual times, to hearing suspicious noises from a certain cottage, or simply to your general reputation for lightness, a medieval euphemism for being a bit too free with your affections. You would have to defend yourself against these accusations, which might involve calling your own witnesses to attest to your good character or provide an alibi. It's like your life story, and everyone else's interpretation of it is being laid bare for the court to judge. A mainstream historical fact that underscores the invasive nature of these courts is the requirement for individuals to undergo compurgation or oath helping. If you were accused of a moral offense and there wasn't direct proof, you might have to swear an oath declaring your innocence. But your oath alone often wasn't enough. You would need a certain number of neighbors, typically 11 or 12, to swear alongside you that they believed your oath was true. These were known as compurgators or oath helpers. This wasn't testimony to the facts of the case. They probably didn't witness anything, but rather a collective vote of confidence in your honesty and reputation. If you couldn't find enough neighbors willing to stake their own spiritual well-being on your truthfulness, you were often found guilty, regardless of the actual facts. This system utterly tied your legal standing to your community standing and the collective perception of your private life, as shaped by gossip and daily observation. It's basically a popularity contest where the loser gets fined and has to stand outside in a sheet. And the punishments? While severe physical penalties were less common in church courts than secular ones, they couldn't usually impose sentences that involved bloodshed. The punishments were designed to be humiliating and public, ensuring your transgression was known far and wide. You might be fined, which in a cash-poor medieval society could be a significant hardship. You might be ordered to perform public penance, which could involve standing barefoot in front of the church during Mass, wearing a simple shift or even a sheet, confessing your sin aloud. You might be required to walk a procession, perhaps holding a candle to a local shrine or around the marketplace, your shame on full display. In some cases, for repeated or serious offenses, you could be excommunicated, effectively cast out of the religious and social community, which was a terrifying prospect. Imagine the walk of shame, but with centuries of religious weight and the entire village watching. You might try to hide your face, but everyone knows who you are. They saw you in court. They heard the sentence. Your private sin, as defined by the church and reinforced by community denunciation, is now a public spectacle, a cautionary tale for others. There is no escaping the consequences, not just legally, but socially. Your reputation, already battered by gossip, is now formally ruined. Your sin, part of the public record in communal memory. These court records are one of the reasons we know so much about medieval people's lives, including their struggles with the church's moral code. They provide a fascinating, if sometimes skewed, window into the intimate lives of ordinary people. You see individuals trying to explain themselves, offering excuses, sometimes denying everything despite overwhelming testimony. You read about couples accused of living together before marriage, individuals caught in adulterous affairs, disputes over betrothals, and even cases involving accusations of sexual violence, though these were often handled differently and perhaps less effectively. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to these courts is the concept of correction or reformation of manners. The church courts saw themselves not just as places of judgment, but as institutions tasked with guiding people back to a righteous path. Punishments were often framed as penance, acts intended to purify the soul and demonstrate remorse. Sometimes people were bound over to ensure good behavior, meaning they had to promise, often with financial penalties attached, not to repeat the offense. There are records of individuals being ordered to avoid certain people, especially if they were involved in an illicit relationship, or to attend church regularly, or to perform specific acts of charity. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about attempting to reintegrate the sinner into the moral fold, often through highly public displays of submission and repentance. It's like being given community service, but the community service is confessing your sins while wearing a funny hat. Historians still argue whether the church courts were primarily motivated by genuine religious concern for people's souls or by a desire to assert ecclesiastical authority and control over lay behavior, and even generate revenue through fines. Were they truly trying to make people more pious, or were they building their own power base? It's probably a complex mix, varying depending on the time period, the region, and the specific cleric involved. But regardless of the primary motivation, the effect was undeniably a legal system that reached deep into the lives of ordinary people, scrutinizing their most intimate relationships and activities and imposing public penalties for deviation. Secular courts existed too, of course, dealing with the crimes like theft, assault, and murder. They might occasionally handle cases that touched on sexual matters, particularly if they involve violence or property disputes, like seduction leading to a broken marriage contract or rape, though the legal definition and prosecution of rape varied hugely and was often deeply flawed from a modern perspective. However, for the vast majority of moral and sexual transgressions that didn't involve physical harm or major property loss, the church courts were the primary jurisdiction. This meant that the definition of crime expanded beyond acts against the state or person to include acts against God and the moral order as defined by the church. This constant legal oversight, sitting alongside the omnipresent gaze of neighbors in the church's spiritual authority, created a multi-layered system of surveillance and control over your private life. You weren't just accountable to your conscience or your family, you were accountable to your neighbors, your priest, and ultimately, the ecclesiastical courts. And this accountability was rarely, if ever, a private affair. From the initial denunciation, often public knowledge, to the court hearing with witnesses, to the public penance, every step of the process ensured that your transgression was known and judged by the community. Think about it. You live in close quarters, visible to everyone. You confess your sins, including sexual ones, to a priest who might also be your neighbor and part of the community network. Your neighbors watch your every move and talk about you constantly. If they think you've crossed a line, they might denounce you to the church authorities. You are then hauled before a court, where your life and reputation are debated in a semi-public setting. If found guilty, your punishment is often designed to publicly shame you. Where in that chain is there any room for privacy? It simply doesn't exist. Your private life, particularly your sex life, is a matter of public concern, subject to public scrutiny, public judgment, and public punishment. It's enough to make you want to crawl under a rock, or perhaps just very carefully conform to every single rule. Good luck with that in a crowded, gossipy village. This intricate dance between community norms, religious doctrine, and formal legal processes meant that your intimate life was not just potentially public, it was structurally and legally exposed. The courts didn't just punish, they revealed. They didn't just judge, they documented. They took what you might desperately want to keep hidden and dragged it out into the light, adding another layer to the already overwhelming lack of privacy that defined medieval existence. So you've been through the ringer. You've squeezed into tiny shared living spaces, worked out in the open fields or workshops, navigated streets where every face was familiar and every move was watched. You've lived under the watchful eye of your neighbors, felt the weight of community expectation on your marriage and relationships, confessed your deepest secrets and perhaps some fibs to your priest, and maybe even faced the public humiliation of the church courts for stepping out of line. We've peeled back layer after layer, from the straw on the floor of your cottage to the legal records of your misdemeanors, and the picture that emerges is one of near total, inescapable visibility. Remember the crowded houses? The multi-generational families crammed into a few small rooms, sharing beds, eating together, conducting the essential business of life, death, and procreation within earshot of each other. That wasn't just inconvenient, it was the bedrock of this lack of physical privacy. You couldn't retreat to your own room to escape watchful eyes or whispered conversations, because there were no private rooms in the modern sense. Your personal space was measured in inches, not square feet, and it was always shared space. Even the wealthiest noble, with more rooms available, still lived a life surrounded by servants, retainers, and family, with doors often open or easily accessible. Privacy as a solitary state simply wasn't part of the architectural or social design. Then you step outside and it's the same story. The village wasn't just a collection of buildings. It was a living, breathing organism where everyone was connected. You worked in the fields alongside others, your labor visible and communal. You fetched water from the same well, washed clothes in the same stream, bought goods in the same market square. There were few anonymous faces. Everyone knew everyone else, or at least knew who they belonged to and where they lived. This constant physical proximity meant that your daily life unfolded in a public arena. Your arguments with your spouse, your interactions with your children, your friendships, your enmities, they were all potentially observed and commented upon. And oh, the commentary. The gossip mill wasn't just a pastime, it was a powerful engine of social control. Remember how quickly news traveled? Rumor-twisted facts and reputations were built or shattered on the strength of whispered words. In a world without mass media, where information flowed through personal networks, the grapevine was king. And what was more interesting, more tantalizing, more morally charged than the private lives of others, especially their romantic and sexual entanglements. Every illicit glance, every late-night meeting, every suspected infidelity or premarital pregnancy was dissected, judged, and transmitted throughout the community. This constant, informal surveillance was arguably just as powerful as any formal system, creating an environment where keeping secrets, especially sexual ones, was incredibly difficult and risky. It's like living inside a perpetually broadcasting reality show where everyone is a contestant and also a judge. And the prize for winning is not getting publicly shamed. The church was another omnipresent force that dissolved the boundaries between public and private, particularly in the realm of sexuality and morality. Your parish priest wasn't just a spiritual guide. He was often a local authority figure who knew your family history, your social standing, and through the confessional, your sins. Confession itself, while a private act between confessor and penitent, placed your inner moral life under institutional scrutiny. And the church's broader role in defining marriage, policing sexual behavior, and administering sacraments meant it had a vested interest in and considerable power over your intimate life. Failure to adhere to its rules, even in seemingly private matters, could lead to formal consequences, from denied communion to being hauled before those ecclesiastical courts we discussed. Those courts were perhaps the clearest example of how the legal system actively prevented privacy. Forget the idea of a separation between church and state or private morality and public law. In the medieval mind, moral transgressions were threats to the social and divine order, and thus subject to legal process. Accusations of fornication, adultery, incest, bigamy, acts that today we might see as purely personal choices, though some are still illegal, were subject to formal investigation. Witnesses were called, oaths were sworn, reputations were debated, and punishments were often designed to be public and humiliating. Standing in a sheet outside the church, walking in procession confessing your sins. These weren't just penalties, they were performances of public shaming, ensuring that your failure to live up to the community's moral standards, particularly regarding sex and family, was known by everyone. It's hard to maintain an aura of mystery when you're doing the walk of shame in a linen shift. Taken together, these elements, the architecture of shared space, the visibility of work and daily life, the power of community gossip, the moral authority and legal reach of the church, the public nature of legal proceedings and punishments, created a society where what we consider privacy simply didn't exist as a concept or a practical reality. Your life, including your most intimate relationships and activities, was lived out in the open, subject to constant observation, judgment, and control by your community, your church, and the law. There was no clear line dividing your private self from your public persona because your persona was public. A mainstream historical fact that highlights this is the communal nature of medieval identity itself. You weren't just you were you, son, daughter of X from this village, tied irrevocably to your family, your lord, your guild, your parish. Individual identity was deeply embedded within these collective structures. The idea of an autonomous self with a right to a private sphere, separate from communal oversight, wasn't part of the dominant worldview. Your behavior, including your sexual behavior, wasn't seen as solely your business. It affected your family's honor, your community's moral standing, and potentially the wrath of God on everyone. This made your life a matter of public concern by definition. Contrast this with today. We live in boxes within boxes, our homes, our cars, our cubicles, our personal phones. We have locks on doors, curtains on windows, firewalls on computers. We communicate through channels that are theoretically private, encrypted messages, phone calls, personal emails. We have laws specifically designed to protect aspects of our privacy from government and corporate intrusion. We have social norms that dictate you shouldn't eavesdrop on conversations, read someone's mail, or comment on their personal relationships unless invited. While modern society has its own forms of surveillance, CCTV, data tracking, social media monitoring, they operate differently. They are often corporate or governmental, less focused on immediate face-to-face community moral policing, and we at least have a concept of a right to privacy, however imperfectly it's upheld. The medieval lack of privacy wasn't about technology or lack thereof. It was structural and ideological. It was about a society built on visibility, interdependence, and collective responsibility, where the boundaries between the individual, the family, the community, and the divine were far more permeable than they are today. Your neighbor didn't just happen to see you doing something. They were part of a system that expected them to monitor and report behavior that deviated from the norm. especially anything related to sexual morality or marital conduct. It wasn't just accepted that your life was public. It was required. It was the air you breathed. It was the social glue that held the community together, for better or worse. A quirky or fringe tidbit that reflects this ingrained visibility is the use of symbols and signs on houses, clothing, and even bodies. People were often easily identifiable not just by face, but by the livery they wore, identifying their lord, the cut of their clothes indicating status or profession, or even physical markers related to pilgrimage or punishment, like badges or brands, though the latter were less common for moral offenses. While not directly about sex, this constant visual coding reinforced the idea that identity and status were publicly performed and legible, leaving little room for ambiguity or anonymity, even before you got to the really juicy gossip about who was sleeping with whom. It's like everyone walked around with a public profile page permanently displayed. Historians still argue whether this pervasive lack of privacy was primarily a form of social control imposed by the church and authorities, or a natural consequence of pre-industrial living conditions and the practical necessities of communal life. Was it a deliberate system to keep people in line, or just how life unfolded when you lived that close together and relied on each other so heavily? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. The practicalities of space and resources certainly limited physical privacy, but the church and community actively leveraged that visibility to enforce moral codes and maintain social order. It wasn't just accidental, it was integrated into the social fabric. It's like asking if a fish tank is designed to control the fish or just where the fish happen to live. Probably a bit of both. So next time you complain about intrusive social media algorithms or nosy neighbors, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. They didn't just lack a "do not disturb" sign, they lacked the very idea of weighing to one. Their bedrooms were public spaces, their relationships community property, and their indiscretions fodder for sermons, gossip, and court cases. The story of privacy, or the lack thereof, in medieval times isn't just about sex. It's about the fundamental differences in how societies have structured themselves and perceived the boundary, or lack of one, between the individual and the collective. It's a reminder that our modern expectations of personal space and secrecy are relatively recent inventions, built atop centuries where hiding in plain sight was the only option. And often even that wasn't possible. You existed in a constant state of being seen, known, and judged. Your life was an open book, not because you chose to share it, but because the binding was rotten and the pages were constantly fluttering in the public breeze. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is why privacy, particularly when it came to something as fundamental and often messy as sex and relationships, was never really a possibility in the medieval world. It was a performance stage for a perpetual audience, whether you liked it or not. As the weight of all that visibility settles in, feel the contrast with the quiet of your own space now. The darkness around you holds no watchful eyes, no gossiping neighbors, no priest taking notes for confession. The silence isn't judging your life choices, it's simply inviting you to rest. Imagine the walls of your room, solid and opaque, holding the world out, keeping your space private. The door is closed, locked if you wish, a simple action they could barely dream of for true solitude. There is just you, here, now, drifting away from the crowded, noisy, utterly public world we've explored tonight. Let the images of shared beds and bustling streets fade. Let the echoes of courtroom whispers and public confessions grow faint. You are safe here, unseen, just a consciousness unwinding in the dark. There are no witnesses to your thoughts, no audience for your dreams, just peace, quiet, and the gentle hum of the night settling in. Relax your body one limb at a time. Feel the support beneath you, the softness of your pillow. Breathe in slowly and out, letting go of the day, letting go of the stories, letting go of any lingering thoughts of public scrutiny. You are your own private island tonight. Safe and sound, just ease into the stillness and let sleep find you.